Good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to People, Place and Power, the Grand Jury Records in Local History, a research showcase marking the centenary of the Custom House Fire 1921. My name is Peter Crooks. I'm from the Department of History in Trinity College Dublin, and I'm the director of the Beyond 2022 research project, Ireland's Virtual Record Treasury. Beyond 2022 is a key legacy project from the Decade of Centenaries, and it's funded by the Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sport and Media. And I want to take this opportunity to thank the Commemorations Unit in that department for their support in working towards today's event. We're working today also in collaboration with the local government archivists and record managers. That's a group representing local archive services up and down the country. And we're very excited about this collaboration. Later this afternoon, we will be taking you on a visit virtually to 3 local archives in Donegal, in Offaly and Wicklow, and a panel session in the second half of this afternoon event will talk to the local service archivists about democratizing local history. During the event, we'll be releasing lots of new material, including a new publication about the grand jury records that we're profiling today, and a stunning set of historical maps that you can explore. So there'll be lots of things to look forward to during the afternoon. There'll also be an opportunity for you to get involved, to ask questions. You can use the Q&A function in this webinar to log those questions, and we'll take some time to answer at the end of this session, which will be coming to an end at about 3:30, followed by a short break. And then when we return after the panel, there'll be time for some more questions of our speakers and participants. So in this first hour, I'll be delighted to introduce you very shortly to the experts who will tell us more about the grand jury system in Ireland and its records, and why we are profiling them on this particularly important day in the history of the Custom House. But before we go to the first of those speakers, I'm very, very glad to introduce a man who has had a busy morning already. We are speaking today virtually from the Trinity Long Room Hub Arts and Humanities Research Institute, but also jointly virtually from the Custom House itself on this its centenary day. So a very special thanks to the Custom House and the Department of Housing, Local Heritage and Government for their participation and support. And representing the department, I'd like to hand now to Tim Carey, Principal Officer in Communications and Facilities Management from the department, to talk to us about this centenary moment. Over to you, Tim.
Thank you, Peter. Good afternoon, everyone. This is my back room of my house. Alas, it's not the Custom House. Unfortunately, it wasn't able to get the connectivity in terms of where I needed to be. I'm delighted to be here representing the department on this very special day for the department. As Peter said, a busy morning. I've just come from the event to mark the centenary of the burning of the Custom House, featuring the minister and relatives of those who took part and who were killed in the attack, both IRA casualties and civilian casualties. And I want to just share screen for a minute just to show what the event was all about. I'll just click here now. And so if you had any doubts about the level of destruction of the Custom House that began on this day in 1921, the next few photographs should leave you in no doubt as to how badly it was damaged. This is from the Liffey side. This was the original central hall or custom hall or long room of the Custom House, really the hub of the Custom House. Alas, that wasn't rebuilt after the fire, but became basically the site of the boiler. And 2 other images, one on the right is the dome, and one on the left just an indication of just the general destruction of the building. Now I'll just stop sharing screens there if that's okay. Stop share, and so, you know, I suppose I'm very fortunate to work in a department that takes its history very very seriously. It's largely through its close association with one of what is obviously one of the most significant buildings in the country, the Custom House, and its association with one of the most important events of the War of Independence, the burning of the Custom House. But it's also its long-standing association with local government, beginning with the local government boards and continuing to this very day. And it's a department, I suppose, like all departments, they go through their many iterations. I don't know how many it's gone through since the founding of the state, but I've been there for 4 years and I'm in its 3rd iteration. But local government remains central to the department's identity. And that's not just, you know, paying lip service to the audience that we have today. It genuinely is a strongly felt belief and understanding in the Custom House and in the department that it has always been the home of local government, and they take that responsibility very seriously. Personally, I'm very pleased to, as I'm actually partly product of local government. I worked in Donegal County Council for 15 years, and as heritage officer for most of them. And during that time, I was actually responsible for the management of the archives of the council. So I know what wonderful resources you have, and I know some of the stories that are hidden amongst those archives that are there waiting to be told. And most of the records in Donegal were pre-1930 and were kept in what was known as the vault, which was basically a very large safe. When you went in to conduct research or find a document, you turned on the light inside and a red light went on outside in case someone actually decided to lock you in to the vault. And the red light showed the passers-by that someone was actually stuck in it. And I can actually still smell the vault from for some reason. A seminal event in the history of local government and the history of democracy was the 1898 Local Government Act, which marked a shift from a landlord-dominated system to one with a much wider franchise, now regarded as the second tier of democracy in Ireland. And indeed, for the Irish Parliamentary Party, local government became very much a focus point of activity. The 1899 elections that took place throughout Ireland dramatically saw a shift in the balance of power to nationalist Ireland, at least principally in this jurisdiction. And as local, county, urban and rural districts became the place of influence for nationalism. And I suppose in keeping with the theme of your day, it's where it influences people, place and power in a very real and day-to-day manner. Sinn Féin also saw this connection and saw the winning of control of local councils as a key battleground, and making a firm link between the separatist movement and again, this sense of local people, place and power. And none more so was that in evidence than in the 1920 elections. Indeed, such was the importance that I think local government had been given by the nationalist movement that the Custom House became a natural target for the IRA. Not only was it one of the most prominent buildings in Ireland, it was the second most important government building after Dublin Castle and the most important in terms of civil administration. And though it held, this was everything, when you look at the files, the amount of the varying roles that people in the Custom House played, from the Stamp Office, Inland Revenue, and the predecessor to today's Public Appointments Commission, it was also, I think most importantly, the home of local government. The Custom House was the building where people, place and power intersected. It's ironic that Dublin's two great Gandans buildings were destroyed during the revolutionary period, along with the records that they contained. There's a little bit of debate, and I would debate with some of the historians about this, about the nature of the attack on the Custom House. You know, was it the attack to destroy the building or destroy the records? And from my view, it was probably both. One was, you know, symbolic, this, you know, the destruction of Dublin's finest building, one that was known in many parts of the world, and then one that still was and still is incredibly photogenic. So the burning of the Custom House made front page news throughout the world. And the other was practical, the destruction of records. For many decades now, both the Custom House and the forecourts have been restored and reopened. But whatever the challenge of reconstructing buildings is, reconstructing a destroyed archive presents far more difficult challenges. And believe that the Beyond 22 group can clearly testify to that. However, today, dozens of county archives and libraries have been preserving and restoring surviving records, copies of which were destroyed in the fire of 1921 in the Custom House. And so this duplication, while it is not a complete replication of what was destroyed, it goes a long way to filling what was a very important historical gap. And this work is critical to helping to reopen Ireland's history to its own people. And I'm pleased that the department, and including my section, has supported some recent initiatives by local government archivists and records managers, including the marking of the centenary of the 1920 local elections in Ireland with a very fine booklet. And it's interesting, I suppose, that was the last All-Ireland election, but I'm glad that we have representatives on the call today from the Armagh Robinson Library, Northern Ireland local authorities and the Public Records Office in Northern Ireland, all of whom are united in our desire to record and manage our collective past. On the centenary of a day when 9 people lost their lives, an iconic public building was destroyed and many of the country's records were burned, the Department of Housing Local Government is very pleased to welcome you, alas virtually, but hopefully maybe not next time we do this, we won't be virtual, to what is sure to be a forward-linking and constructive collaboration with Beyond 2022 and the Virtual Record Treasury of Ireland and the Local Government Archives and Record Management Group. So I hope you all have a very interesting and illuminating afternoon discussing and hearing about people, place and power, grand jury records and local history.
Thank you very much, Tim, for so perfectly setting us up for today's discussion, putting us right in the context of what happened at the Custom House 100 years ago today, and for reflecting on the importance of the local archive services in reconstructing our collective history. And that's, of course, exactly the collaboration that we want to foster through the Beyond 2022 project. We're turning now to the deeper history behind the sort of the precursors to the county councils, the grand jury records that we are profiling today. And in this first session, our panel of experts will be talking to us about the grand jury system that created those records and the sorts of materials, documents, maps, etc., that are preserved in local archives and national collections across Ireland. Our first speaker, Virginia Crossman, is Professor Emerita at Oxford Brookes, and when we told our colleagues in the local archive services that Virginia was able to speak to us today about this, there was a great excitement because in those circles, Virginia is something of a celebrity as the author of Local Government in 19th Century Ireland, the standard work, which they all seem to have on the tables beside them as we planned this event, and I even heard referred to as the Bible. So who better to introduce us to the grand jury system in 19th century Ireland than Virginia Crossman. Over to you, Virginia.
Thank you. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to talk about the history of the grand jury system in Ireland and its role in local administration. I spent many hours in local archives in the late 1980s, early 1990s, looking at the records of grand juries and other local bodies when I was doing my postdoctoral research. And at that time, I remember sort of telling people what I was doing and getting really quite a negative reaction. People didn't really understand why that would be something that was worth doing. This was a period when academic historians were looking really, focusing almost exclusively on sort of the national question, national politics, and local politics and local administration in particular was thought to be something of much less value. And as a result, the study of sort of local history and local politics, certainly in an academic setting, was rather neglected. Now, I think that's not nearly so much the case today, I'm very happy to say. And this, I think, is a really important development because local issues are actually those which affect ordinary people most immediately. And as I hope to show today, they're also the ones that have a wider national impact because they reflect wider national questions. In this paper, I want to provide a brief overview of the development and reputation of the grand jury in Ireland, and to consider what this tells us about the nature and perception of local government more generally. The system of local government that developed in Ireland was modelled on that of Britain. The earliest representatives of central authority in the Irish localities, the county sheriff and local magistrates, were adjuncts of the legal system imported to Ireland from England, and the division of Ireland into counties and boroughs also followed an English exemplar. The main divergence between English and Irish administrative practice was in the survival in Ireland of the grand jury, which, as well as hearing legal cases, became the chief organ of Irish county administration. The grand jury was made up of 23 men nominated by the High Sheriff from the leading property owners in the county, excluding peers of the realm. Grand juries had been granted taxing powers in the 17th century to pay for the upkeep of roads and bridges, and these powers had gradually been extended to cover other local matters, such as the building and repair of jails and courthouses, and to pay the salary of a parish watch. Towards the end of the 18th century, the taxing powers of grand juries were extended into the field of social welfare. They could make contributions towards the establishment and upkeep of county infirmaries and workhouses, and also local dispensaries. Now, these acts were enabling rather than prescriptive, which meant that grand juries could choose whether or not to take advantage of them. But in the early 19th century, an element of compulsion was introduced. In 1817, for example, the first of a series of acts was passed, making provision for the erection of district lunatic asylums, the costs being levied on counties through the grand jury. In 1822, central government took over responsibility for the policing of Irish counties, with the costs again being levied locally through the grand jury. Thus, while the grand jury remained the primary organ of local government in the county, its function was becoming as much a taxing as an administrative body. And the nature and level of county cess, or the sort of local tax, was one of the roots of dissatisfaction with the grand jury system. Not alone did the amount of cess levied increase over the first half of the 19th century, rising from about £0.9 million in 1830, and that's a national figure, to over 1.3 million in 1840. But the proportion made up of compulsory presentments also increased. Compulsory presentments were amounts that the grand jury was obliged by law to pass, but over which it had no control. So things like the police, where the grand jury simply had to pass amounts to fund the police, but had no control over them. In County Down, for example, imperative or compulsory presentments were 5 times greater in 1830 than they had been in 1802, and they made up over 25% of total presentments. So a quarter of total presentments were compulsory in 1830, compared to around 10% in 1802. Cesspayers and grand jurors criticised the rise in compulsory presentments. Cesspayers disliked paying increased tax, while grand jurors resented having to pass expenditure which they could not control. The issue became somewhat less pressing in later decades as central government took on more of the cost of local services. The full cost of the constabulary was taken onto the Consolidated Fund in 1846, for example, and in 1875, central government took over a portion of the costs of lunatic asylums. Irish grand juries have generally had a bad press, whether in contemporary literature or historical analysis. The main criticisms made of grand juries were that they were unrepresentative, inefficient, and corrupt. County cess was levied on the occupier rather than the owner of land, so that grand jurors, who were by definition property owners, were primarily engaged in taxing not themselves, but their tenants. Furthermore, the vast majority of grand jurors were Protestant, whilst the vast majority, of course, of tenants were Catholic. Since the High Sheriff's discretion in the nomination of the grand jury was total, and since he was generally a political appointment, it frequently happened that grand juries were selected according to the closeness of their relationship to the High Sheriff, rather than their social standing, which was how they were meant to be. They were meant to be put in order of property and standing. John Knox, a Sligo landowner, wrote indignantly to the Marquis of Sligo in 1832 that he had been placed 44th on the grand jury panel, when his property in the county entitled him to a much higher place. Catholics were excluded from grand juries until 1793, and even after that date, few were selected to serve, even in counties where there were Catholic landowners. Thus, when politics intruded into the grand jury room, it was largely the politics of Protestant ascendancy. At the Spring Assizes of 1807, for example, the grand jury of County Tyrone entered a unanimous resolution against Catholic emancipation. It was also widely alleged that grand jurors exploited their position for personal gain. In the early 19th century, anyone wishing to make or repair a road simply drew up a certificate stating the necessity of the work and the estimated cost, had this attested by two persons before a justice of the peace, and then submitted it to the grand jury. Multiple presentments could easily be made for the same piece of road, or even non-existent pieces of road. Writing about the appalling state of roads in the far west of Ireland in the 1820s, William Maxwell attributed their neglect to the atrocious system of peculation carried on by grand juries. Roads have been passed as completed when their lines have been but roughly marked out, and bridges been actually paid for, the necessary accounting affidavits having been sworn to in open court when not a stone was ever laid. And since there was no limit to the amount that grand juries could levy, there was no incentive for grand jurors to reject presentments. As one Tipperary magistrate noted in 1814, few will object to the jobs of their neighbours, provided that none object to theirs. Speaking in the House of Commons in 1833, Lord Clements, who represented County Leitrim, stated that the roads in Leitrim were impassable, except in those parts where grand juries resided. Even when grand juries did attempt to conduct their business honestly, they found major obstacles in their way. The sheer number of presentments, for example, made careful consideration of each one virtually impossible. In the mid-1820s, the grand jury of County Down approved over 200 presentments in a single day. Criticism of the grand jury system came not just from cesspayers or local people, or from representatives of the Catholic community, but also from Protestant landowners themselves, who feared that the blatant abuses evident in grand jury administration undermined the position of Protestant landowners as a local elite and set a bad example. As the Whig landowner Thomas Spring Rice observed, under the grand jury system, public burdens have augmented in a most formidable progression. The public works have deteriorated in a similar ratio. The landlord is lowered in general estimation by his acquiescence in a corrupt system. The peasant is impoverished and the community is plundered. Of course, the majority of Irish MPs were drawn from the very class who benefited from the grand jury system and were thus less than eager to reform it. But there was a growing realization that the level of abuse and corruption was reflecting badly on the Irish landowning class as a whole, and was reinforcing the impression that they were irresponsible and inefficient. It was far easier, however, to point out the deficiencies of the grand jury system than to devise solutions. For some, the obvious solution was for central government to take a much more active role in local administration. But this went against British political traditions, which had always been based on a strong distrust of centralised government. The idea was that you should allow local areas to look after their own interests. As Robert Peel warned the Irish Chief Secretary in 1828, to take local administration into the hands of central government in Ireland would be to widen the distinction between England and Ireland and postpone the period at which Irish local affairs can be satisfactorily managed by local authorities. But if power was to remain in the localities, was there any practical alternative to the grand jury as the chief administrative body? The obvious alternative, of course, was the introduction of some form of local democracy, the most frequently suggested form being elected county boards. And these were being suggested right from the sort of beginning of the 19th century. But this was a reform too far for British ministers, at least until the end of the 19th century. And this is hardly surprising, perhaps, given that even in England, county administration remained in the hands of unelected magistrates until 1888. Having rejected the idea of radical reform, ministers had a number of options. They could go down the road of centralisation. They could attempt to prevent abuses and limit the opportunities for corruption, or they could establish new institutions to take responsibility for local administration. In the event, they explored all of these options. Central government increasingly took over the supervision, if not the administration, of local services. Policing and education, for example, were directed from Dublin Castle. At the same time, a series of reforms was introduced in the early decades of the 19th century to provide for a more satisfactory scrutiny of and accounting for grand jury expenditure. In 1833, for example, an act was passed which allowed a small number of cesspayers, sort of local taxpayers, chosen by the grand jury to examine presentments prior to their consideration by the grand jurors. It also required all presentments passed by the grand jury to be executed by contracts made on sealed tenders and overseen by qualified surveyors appointed by the government. Perhaps more importantly, however, the grand jury was increasingly eclipsed as an organ of local administration by the Poor Law Board. The Poor Law, introduced in 1836, provided an alternative administrative structure to that of the grand jury, and one which was more representative of ratepayer interests, while still providing a major role for local landowners. There was less overt criticism of the grand jury in the second half of the 19th century, but the system was tolerated rather than embraced by Irish people, mainly because it was so firmly associated with the landowning class. The fact that local administration as a whole was mainly the preserve of the landed elite was a growing cause of frustration to Irish nationalists. Thus, an editorial in the Palm-Light newspaper United Ireland in 1882 declared that the most pressing necessity to local political and social life in Ireland was to abolish its incubus, the existing system of local government. All the local power is held by the landlords and the nominees of the castle, the paper noted. From the castle to the grand jury room, all the boards and bodies are the camps and strongholds of the English garrison. They must be routed before we can breathe freely in Ireland. One result of this frustration was a concerted attempt to take control of those local bodies that had an elected element, such as town and city councils and poor law boards. Once this had been achieved, attitudes to a local administration began to shift. There was still dissatisfaction and distrust, but whereas at the beginning of the 19th century, it was the Catholic population that felt shut out from and distrustful of local government, now it was the landed elite who increasingly found themselves excluded or outnumbered. When grand juries lost their administrative functions at the end of the 19th century, with the establishment of elected county and district councils, the main impetus behind the reform was less a desire to democratise local government in Ireland and more the need to bring Ireland into step with the rest of the United Kingdom. Discussing proposals to replace Irish grand juries with popularly elected councils in 1892, the Irish Chief Secretary, Arthur Balfour, candidly admitted that nobody supposes that any new machinery will work any more efficiently than that which already exists. The main object of establishing the new machinery is to remove any sense of unequal treatment between the three portions of the United Kingdom. While he accepted that grand juries would have to be replaced by county councils, Balfour worried that the election of councillors on a popular franchise, as in England, would hand power over to people who were very poor, very ignorant, and in all probability, very extravagant. Such people, he feared, would be directly by their votes and indirectly through the patronage exercised by their representatives, serve the interest of their political party, regardless of the necessities of sound administration. The early years of the new system of elected county and district councils did not bring about the chaos predicted by unionists, but many remain convinced that the new county councils would operate according to a well-established tradition. An article in the Monthly Review in 1902 noted that since the 18th century, Irish representative councils have shown themselves rather political debating societies than business-like assemblies, and neither the reformed corporations nor the newly created councils, whether county or district, have proved any exception to the rule. Everywhere over at least 3/4 of Ireland, we find them turning from the administrative work for which they were called into being to indulge in political declamation, while the rates are everywhere rising and the roads deteriorating. Such remarks demonstrate the extent to which Irish local government was still seen to be working in the interests of a particular class or group, rather than in the interests of the community as a whole. The point I want to stress here is that this perception derived less from the merits or otherwise of the system than from the extent to which people felt their interests were not being protected or were being protected. Thus, at the beginning of the 19th century, critics of the grand jury system attacked its domination by the Protestant landlord class, claiming that it was operated by landlords for landlords. And similar accusations were made against poor law boards in the early decades of the poor law system. But with the growth in tenant-dominated poor law boards, the nature of complaints began to change. It was now landlord interests that were being ignored and tenants who were exploiting the system to their own advantage. And we can see the same criticisms being made of local councils after 1898. Control of local administration could never be seen as a non-political issue, which was always rather the hope that local politics didn't have to be affected by nasty party political concerns. It would sort of be more non-political. And British ministers really tried, their aspiration was to get to that point. But I would argue that was, as I say, that's always unrealistic. The idea that local government represented a potential area of cooperation between different classes and religions simply wasn't going to work in Ireland, where there was a central lack of trust between central government and the people. Crucially as well, I think, there was a lack of agreement about what constituted good government in a local setting. The highly politicised atmosphere in which local government operated throughout the 19th century made the establishment of any such agreement impossible. There were too many competing demands and expectations. Ministers and their officials looked for efficiency and economy, with efficiency being judged more by adherence to statutory regulations than the effective delivery of local services. Ratepayers wanted low rates and services relevant to their needs, while at the same time, those with personal or political links to local representatives expected to be remembered in the awarding of jobs and contracts. Landowners demanded direct representation on local bodies to ensure the protection of their interests, while popular politicians sought a public platform to which to publicise their views and policies and a means of consolidating local support. Clearly, not all of these demands and expectations could be met, and the resulting disappointment and resentment contributed to the negative light in which local government was seen by many Irish people. Constitutional nationalists, from Daniel O'Connell to John Redmond, sought to convince the British that Ireland deserved to be treated as the other constituent parts of the United Kingdom, and that the Irish people could be trusted to adhere to British administrative standards and practices. Calling for the reform of Irish municipal corporations in 1835, O'Connell argued that the only means of preserving the connection between Britain and Ireland was by allowing the Irish people to share the advantages of British institutions. A significant body of Irish nationalists, however, came to reject British values and institutions along with British rule. Cultural nationalism aimed to create an Irish identity that owed nothing to Britain or to British culture. An independent government, it was hoped, would sweep away the administrative remnants of British rule and establish authentically Irish institutions at both national and local level. The intention announced in the democratic programme of the First Dáil to abolish the odious, degrading and foreign poor law system, substituting therefore a sympathetic native scheme, was very much in keeping with this anti-British sentiment. Boards of guardians were finally abolished in 1925, being replaced by county boards of health and public assistance. In other respects, however, the structures of local government in Ireland remain largely unchanged, though many of its functions were gradually transferred either directly to central government or to appointed bodies. Indeed, local authorities tended to be regarded with as much suspicion and disfavour by Irish government ministers as they had by their British predecessors. Tim Healy recalled being told by a Free State minister in 1926 that county councils represented the Magna Carta of jobbery. Such comments are evidence of the extent to which Irish political attitudes, as well as administrative structures, continued, and arguably continue, to be shaped by the legacy of and divisions created by British rule. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Virginia. Wonderful overview of the grand jury system and the impulses behind its reform in 1898, which of course takes us up to where Tim Carey began with the 1921 destruction of the Custom House and the local government records. I'll go straight, if I may, to our next segment, where I'm delighted to welcome two of my colleagues in the Beyond 2022 project, Brian Guren and David Brown. Congratulations to both Brian and David today, because we are publishing, in collaboration with the local government archivists and record managers, a beautiful booklet, which is free. You can find it on our website. We'll put a link into the chat during Brian's talk, documenting the system and its records, and really revealing the richness of the records. So I'll hand across to Brian first, and then Brian will hand to Dave, and then we'll come back to me. So over to you, Brian.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm just going to share a screen now. I have a few PowerPoint.
That's great.
Is that sharing?
That is.
Great. Okay, thank you, Peter. Now, I was first drawn to grand jury records through my interest in the census. Now, you may know that Ireland's first census was authorised to be taken by Parliament to commence in May 1813, with the enumerators travelling from house to house, asking the questions and noting the responses. Now, you may also know that, embarrassingly for William Shaw Mason, the Census Commissioner, the survey failed to fully enumerate the island, and its findings were never published by Parliament. Uniquely among Irish censuses, the Act specified that the enumeration was to be initiated by the grand juries in the counties at the spring assizes of 1913. I'm not going to go into the details of why the 1813 enumeration failed. Sorry, did I say 1913, 1813? The 1813 enumeration failed. But since there was grand jury involvement in the survey, it seemed reasonable that I might find traces of it in the grand jury records. Now, as I said, the results of the enumeration were never formally published by Parliament, but abstract returns did subsequently appear in the third volume of Shaw Mason's quite magnificent Parochial Survey of Ireland. For some counties, substantial information was provided, and for others, only rudimentary data appeared. You can see here for County Longford, for example, that barony data were provided giving details on housing, questions 1, 2, and 3, employment, question 4, population, question 5, and also population data were given for many of the county's urban centres. For many other counties, however, only the merest data, sometimes partial, were provided. And in this example for County Limerick, it seems reasonable to conclude that the census was not even taken in the two western baronies of Conello Upper and Lower. And if it was taken there, then that those figures have been lost. Now, Limerick's grand jury records for this period, however, tell an entirely different story. Fortunately, the county's surviving printed presentment abstracts have been made available in digital format online, and they cover this period. So if we examine the four relevant volumes between summer 1813 and spring 1815, the real story can be unfolded. At the summer assizes of 1814, a payment of £192.19 was approved by the grand jury to recompense Gerald Blennerhassett for his enumeration work in Clonello Lower. And at the next assizes in 1815, spring 1815, £234.15 was approved for Edward Lloyd's work in Upper Conello. And since both presentments note that the rate of pay was at £5 for every 1,000 people counted, or a shilling for every 10 people counted, it's a trivial matter then to calculate the population figures that were reported for both baronies. So on this map, we can see that the figures that Shaw Mason published were only for the eastern baronies in Limerick. But since we know that a shilling was earned for every 10 people counted, and that is a really, really high rate of pay, it stands to reason then that Lower Clonello's population must have been reported by Blennerhassett at 38,590 plus or minus 10 people, and Upper Conello's was at 46,950 people plus or minus 10. And the entire county's population was counted at 189,405 plus or minus 20 people. Now those figures, since they weren't published by Parliament and since they weren't published in Shaw Mason's publication, they have not seen the light of day since 1815, more than a century before the Custom House was burned, and they simply could not have been recovered without employing grand jury sources. And it's these two specific presentments in Limerick's presentment volumes that allowed them to be revealed. Now, that's just a very simple example of what grand jury records can uniquely tell us about the forgotten past. It's true to say that the grand jury had an unenviably poor public reputation in 19th century Ireland. Allegations of corruption were commonly heard and even appeared in print. Healy Dutton, author of statistical surveys for the Dublin Society, must surely have tested the limits of libel law with his bruising comments about the grand jury in one western county. He informs, "A few public-spirited and honest grand jurors have attempted to stem this torrent of peculation, but the consequence has been that they have been threatened with an opposition to everything they proposed, and the disgraceful expedient was resorted to of polling everything they asked for. One gentleman returned the overplus of a presentment. He was laughed at by his brother jurors. Such is the morality of the county." Very hard-hitting indeed. Perhaps he felt safe enough, though, in the libel stakes, because he did note that the gentlemen of the county are not much in the habit of reading. And Dutton was not alone. Other writers were equally, if not more so, scathing. But in spite of these criticisms, likely justified many of them were, it must be said, the records that have remained from the days that the grand jury had civic duties, and as Virginia said, those days ended in 1899, the records of the grand jury, often ignored in favor of more popular sources, such as British parliamentary papers, newspapers, poor law records, parish registers, civil registration, and the like, they can open up unique and very clear vistas on aspects of the past. So, what might we be able to do with these records in our research? And it is very important to note that although some counties are far better endowed with surviving grand jury material than others, there are surviving sources from the grand juries for all areas and all counties on the island. The most commonly used of the grand jury records are the presentment books. For some areas, the original manuscript books have survived, although most of these were released into the Public Record Office after 1867 and were destroyed. 2 manuscript volumes survived for County Longford, covering the period 1759 to 1907. 1 manuscript volume is available for County Wexford, spanning the years 1817 to 1823. And this volume has recently been digitized, and with impeccable timing, it has to be said, was published online by the county's archives just last week. Also online is the entire collection of Donegal grand jury presentments in Donegal County Archives, which includes a manuscript volume commencing as early as 1753. Manuscript volumes survive for other locations too, including for County Clare, and for all 10 Ulster counties, including the county of the town of Carrickfergus, such as this one here for Carrickfergus. Meath is particularly well covered because most of its records had been retained locally in Trim Courthouse instead of being dispatched to the PRO. However, even if manuscript books have not survived, printed abstracts were published annually by the counties from the latter part of the 18th century, and some of these have survived for all areas. County Wicklow, Limerick, Louth, Wexford, and Donegal, they've made their collections available online, either in part or in their entirety. Presentment books can be a very useful source for historical research. And fundamentally, basically, they're records of planned expenditure by the county. They follow a fairly fixed format, so you can get a handle on them very quickly. All counties had county officers, the county establishment. That included the treasurer, secretaries, jailer, jail chaplains, constables, Irish interpreters, and so on. And these had to be paid out of the county cess or the county tax. This listing of presentments for County Down summarizes 1813. This is particularly useful because the statutes underpinning the payments are all listed. All counties cess money for improving existing roads, building new roads, repairing bridges, and undertaking other substantial capital investments, including repairing breaches in water defences, raising hollows, lowering hills, building drains, and so on. I find that presentments regarding road repairs can be particularly illuminating. They give details on people living in areas and recorded micro-place names now often lost. Joanna Dooley, for instance, lived between Cashel and Cahir in 1817. We may never be able to pinpoint exactly where she lived, but I doubt that many other sources could even tell us that much. There was a place called Giant's Grave on the Rathdrum to Dublin Road in the middle of County Wicklow, and mileposts were erected along that road. Who knew that? They can also tell us quite a lot about women in past times. Although women could not serve on grand juries were all male. We see them appearing in presentment books, albeit less frequently than men's names may appear. Inevitably, they appear in stereotypical roles, including as cleaners and foster parents for foundling children. But they're often mentioned if their property marked the beginning or end of a roadworks task, and in a surprisingly wide variety of employments, and sometimes as contractors. In fact, women appear more regularly in grand jury presentment records than in many other more widely used sources. So in conclusion, in this brief talk, I'm just trying to give a very quick introduction to records which many may not be overly familiar with. The grand jury records are quite unique sources in that they can get us to the very heart of past communities, recording names, locations, occupations, and the land holdings of people at various levels throughout the social hierarchy, and often for extended periods. I'd encourage people to take a dip into grand jury records because you really do never know what they might reveal to you. So thank you very much for listening. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. David Brown, who's going to talk to you about the magnificent grand jury maps that were produced in the 18th and 19th centuries. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that, Brian. I have a bit of background noise here today. One of my neighbours is cutting his house in half with an angle grinder. That's what it seems to sound like, but that's the joys of working from home. I think we're running a little bit late, so like the last person in most relays, I'm going to try to do the final straight quite quickly. We're going to talk about the grand jury maps. They're interesting in two main ways. First and most importantly, they're the most detailed collection of maps produced for Irish counties prior to the Ordnance Survey series that began to appear in the late 1830s. And secondly, they're the first series of Irish maps funded through taxation and not private ventures that were not produced for the purposes of conquest and expropriation. The grand jury maps relate a story of settlement and prosperity. They don't relate a story of conquest. These maps mark a watershed in how Ireland's English conquerors viewed the land that they now controlled. It's settled, it's prosperous, and to a wealthy landowner, at any rate, it's full of opportunity. We're going to have a look, we're going to basically spin back now a few hundred years, and we're going to look at how these maps developed. So what we're looking at here is basically the very beginning. The earliest maps of Ireland were produced for navigation. And this map is from one of our Beyond 2022 archival partners, the Huntington Library in California. It's a medieval interpretation of a description of Ireland attributed to the Egyptian mathematician Ptolemy, written in around 150 AD. The maps were constructed from textual descriptions and interpreted by Byzantine monks from around about the 14th century into pictures. And these Latin copies closely followed on. Rivers feature most prominently, as in the ancient world, and especially to the Egyptians, rivers were the easiest way to get about. So the maps from the earliest times did what maps are supposed to do. They enabled people to find their way around the world. The printed maps of Ireland for general use began to be produced in the mid-16th century. All of these were commercial undertakings, and they appeared first in the Netherlands and Italy and in England by 1600 or so. This is one of the very earliest, published by Abraham Ortelius in Amsterdam in 1572. The image is from the L. Brown collection of digitized early printed maps of Ireland, and Beyond 2022 will be hosting hundreds of maps from this collection on its site next year. These will replace most of the maps that were originally in the national collection and lost in the fire of 1922. Maps produced by the state, however, had a different emphasis. This example from around the same time as Ortelius by Francis Jobson at the National Archives in the UK is intended to tell military planners which peer or Irish sept controlled each area. So using this map, the English crown could determine where its friends and enemies were and plan its conquest of Ireland. It's a strategic map and the first of many detailed local military maps that followed it. But for Irish landowners, conquest was always followed by confiscation. The Elizabethans divided Ireland into counties and baronies, a process called shiring. This plantation map, also from the National Archives in the UK, shows the newly minted barony of Clogher, County Tyrone, and the subdivisions of the old Irish territories, the Ballybeatas and the Ballyboes within them, and the Ballyboes are the rough equivalent of modern townlands.
Apologies, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, David. It's just your audio is dipping slightly in and out. So maybe you could just lean forward a little bit and it might just be a bit more consistent, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay.
Just apologies.
So this is the land in 1609, chopped up and divided into parcels to be doled out to army officers and their cronies. And from this distance, it's a beautiful object, but one made for a very specific purpose. And it's difficult to see on Zoom the detail of the map. So this chart conveys the same general idea as Thomas Raven's map of the barony of Clogher. And the idea is that the barony is divided up into prime and variety cuts. So we can move on another 50 years. We have William Petty's Down Survey of Ireland, continuing on in pretty much the same vein. The cartography is better, but it's basically another map of townlands, and this time for the Dingle Peninsula and from the manuscripts of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. The original maps of these from this series, Down Survey, was kept at the Custom House for 250 years, but then sent to the Four Courts where they were destroyed. The Ballybeatas are gone, as Petty would have nothing to do with ancient Irish landholding patterns. Here the main subdivision is the parish, which is a subdivision of a diocese, not a barony, with a townland within it. The map thus strips away another layer of Irish identity, and with it any representation of the inhabitants, their roads, their homes, and their churches. Looking at the map in some detail, you would be forgiven for thinking that hardly anybody lived there. Perhaps it was through embarrassment over what they had done that the unnamed surveyor left us a clue in the cartouche, and this is over on the top right-hand side. And here you can see a rich land teeming with fish, but hung out to dry. And if you look at a series of these, you'll see that the cartographers had a very, very sharp sense of humour. The limitation of only producing maps of confiscated land can be seen in Petty's map of the Barony of Clogher. And this one is provided to us by the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, 50 years after the map of Clogher that we looked at a couple of minutes ago. But there's no land left now on the map to dole out, so the townland map has now become rather sparse. But luckily Petty had his own personal set, and his surveyors had in fact mapped far more than townlands. The townland maps are what they show to the public. This example is from his own personal collection, and it's now in the British Library. It's a map of Abbey Shrule, County Longford. And we'll be making all of these different editions available eventually on Beyond 2022, again, hopefully by June of next year. Again, once again, it looks like now a standard townland map, but the cartographer has left us a clue in the cartouche. Longford had windmills, and actually Longford had lots and lots of windmills and watermills all along the River Inny, with castles, houses, bridges, and all the other infrastructure of advanced European settlement. You can see this on Petty's private edition, but not on the publicly viewable editions. These are the ones that were kept in the Custom House, in the Record Office, the Auditor General's Office before that, and so on. So when we compare Petty's map, at long last, to the Grand Jury map, we can see that nothing has changed by 1812. The river's in kind of the same place, the abbey's in the same place. That's a bit easier to read. Petty didn't always orientate his maps to the north. They only standardized on this northern orientation in the mid-18th century. We think Petty was just trying to save paper because he kind of squished them in at any angle. But the mills are still there, the ruins of the abbey, roads, evidence of lots and lots and lots of people. The intended line of the Royal Canal is clearly shown. This was completed 5 years later, and the produce of those mills was about to be connected to Dublin and the world. In Longford and elsewhere, the grand juries were not making maps of conquest. They were making maps of settlement, and they had nothing to hide. On the contrary, the grand juries had an intense need to show the world what they had achieved. The grand jury maps were produced on a grand jury scale. Stunning and eye-wateringly expensive productions were published one after the other, as each county was put into its party clothes and paraded around the salons of London. The maps were all engraved, printed and sold in London, and always by the most prestigious engraver available at the time. The grand jurors were fiercely proud of their counties. They lived locally and strived to develop their neighbourhoods, far from the absentees and opportunists who owned much of some counties but took little interest in their welfare, as long as some money kept coming in. Ireland was part of the Union. Larkin's stunning 16-sheet map of Galway, if this is only one sheet, 4 metres by 3 metres when joined and even larger than once it's framed, was produced at the seat of power. This map left the grand jurors imperial masters, and no doubt that their county was at least the equal to any other in the newly united kingdom. In its detail, Larkin's map reveals what Galway had become, with its great houses, its markets, its hundreds of much poorer homes everywhere, its castles, its monuments, its stands of ancient trees. But 30 years later, this was mostly gone, swept away by the twin catastrophes of famine and emigration. The grand jury maps were swept away also, their pride and individuality replaced by the uniforms and uniformity of the Ordnance Survey, and state map making was once again returned exclusively to the military. And now even the paper map is gone. You can still get them, but you have to print them out yourself. Sat-nav will speak at you instead, telling you to turn left in 30 metres, just as Ptolemy's directions guided navigators and allowed the first maps to be visualised 7 centuries ago. So this has been a fast narration of how we got to the grand jury map. And I've also tried to give you a feel for how we at Beyond 2022 are reconstructing the lost collections from the Public Record Office using replacement at libraries around the world. And normally we invite questions from the audience at this point, but from the looks of this audience, no invitation is necessary. So I'll hand back to Peter now to deal with all of that.
Dave, thank you very much indeed for that wonderful visual tour of the stunning cartography collections that we can look forward to. And I would encourage you to look at our map collections that are available from today on the website. Absolutely beautiful, incredible detail that you can explore. Dave's paper brought to mind for me an aphorism by the historian of cartography, Jerry Broughton. He writes, "Map makers do not just reproduce the world, they also construct it." And that seems to be very true of cartography in an Irish context. I think what we'll do is hold questions to the end of the whole session when we'll have time. My colleague Guren Wallace will be in command at that point and will steer us very successfully to any questions that may arise from these papers. Because when we're in the Zoom world, we do need a break. We will start back again very promptly at 15:45, so just over 10 minutes time. During the break, please don't go away. Keep your connection live, because Beyond 2022 is delighted to be participating in the creative strand of the Decade of Centenaries. And through funding supplied by the Department of Culture, we have been delighted to appoint Mairead McLean as our artist in residence, who will be working with us in the next 12 months. Mairead has done extensive work with archives and historical subject matter, and we're going to share with you during the break, as the interval act, a piece that Mairead has done called "A Line Was Drawn." It was created in 2018 and 19, and it reflects her engagement with archives and historical subject matter. She worked with our core partner, Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, Belfast, in creating this, and it explores issues of agency and boundaries and exclusion and voices hidden in the records, very much themes that we're trying to excavate through today's research showcase. So thank you very much. We'll see you again in 10 minutes, and enjoy the break. Thank you to the speakers too.
Once upon a time, draw. Once upon a time, a line was drawn. A line drawn. Once upon a time, there was a line drawn. Once upon a time, a line was drawn. Once upon a time.
England, part of a small island off the west coast of Europe.
Intensive period of real work, the work that King and his soldiers have been trained to do. Day and night the patrols go out, each time on a different route and at a different time, to help confuse a cunning and ruthless enemy. a message comes in of a suspicious parcel in a restaurant. Some Fusiliers are sent to cordon off the area even before they've had time to put their kit down.
Pear. Cup. Pail. Anchor.
The plastic carrier bag eventually turns out to contain nothing more dangerous than soiled babies' nappies.
Bairn. Drink. Sleep. Here in Northern Europe, one of these Indo-European languages about 2,000 years ago divided into three main groups of dialects. The Eastern group, marked roughly here, has quite died out. The Northern group spread across Scandinavia and much later into Iceland. The Western group began to spread over these parts of Europe.
Once upon a time, there was a line.
A helicopter lift to one of the watchtowers over the notorious A1, a road which has seen an above average number of assassinations and ambushes. The army uses Wessex helicopters for lifts and gazelles for observation, 24 hours a day.
And we also get names of food, such as beef, mutton, and sausage.
Getting on with it, living with it.
Their first rendezvous is the tower, overlooking what in army parlance is a VCP. These watchtowers are dotted along the border between Ireland and It's very hard for anyone to move undetected. The VCP checkpoint is also designed to withstand mortars and bombings. This strange set of buildings can be home to a platoon like this for upwards of a month. The fortifications around the towers are reminiscent of the First World War, but the devices that protect the towers come very much from the era of new electronic wizardry. But there is still nothing more effective than the foot patrol, combing the ground, covering one another in a pre-arranged and well-rehearsed pattern. And at every stage of the patrol, they must stay alert.
November 1927. 1 chest of tea, 1 box of sultanas, 43 jars of jam, 1 pound of butter, 4 pounds of margarine, 1 bag of cloves. 13th of February 1932. Silk and silk articles, silk tissue. The 4th of July 1928. 2 bottles of spirits. 25th of July 1932, 46 head of cattle. 2nd of November 1932, 5 live pigs. 20th of July 1932, cigarettes, 6 and 16. 10th of July 1932, spirits, 13 bottles. 21st of February 1932, 100 books of sweepstake tickets. 2nd of August 1928, spirits, 4 bottles. 26th of November 1932, 1 knitted wool coat, value £1 5 shillings. 7th of March 1927, goods destroyed.
Anything, nothing, always, never, nothing, always. Cratered roads, surveillance towers, bullet-riddled gospel halls, empty roads through Eries.
So welcome back, folks, and just to say thanks very much to Mairead McLean for allowing us to show her video there. A line was drawn. It's a pity to have to cut it off before the very end, but we wanted to keep straight on time. On Beyond 2022, we're really pleased to have the Artist in Residence scheme running, the Decade of Centenary's Artist in Residence scheme running. And I think it's a very imaginative thing for the state to have done. So watch out for Mairead and her other fellow artists in the other cultural institutions over the next 18 to 24 months. We're going to turn now to the Archives and Record Managers Group, Local Government Archives and Record Managers Group, who've been collaborating with us very closely over the past months preparing for today's event. And we really are very grateful for their advice, input and expertise on all of this. I'm going to hand over now to Niamh Brennan. Niamh Brennan is the chair of the Local Government Archives and Records Managers Group to say a few words for the second session of today's talk. Thanks, Niamh.
Thanks, Kieran. I'm delighted to be here today representing, as you said, the Local Government Archivists and Records Managers Group. And I hope you can all hear me. It's not always known that under the 1994 Local Government Act, which was a law that was reinforced in 2001, that local authorities are actually required to preserve our county's local archives. And there are few such services in Ireland until the late 1990s. But since legislation reinforced its importance in the 1990s, county and city councils began to started to actually employ archivists, and local archive services developed well into the 2000s. So our group has been in existence now for 20 years, and at present we represent about 18 local authorities. Thankfully, we're still expanding with each year as more and more councils employ professional archivists and come to appreciate the importance of providing archives and records management services. Our group is honoured to be partners in this wonderful project and in this event today. it gives us an opportunity to showcase some of the extraordinary and unique 18th and 19th century archives of the grand juries that we preserve. So much of the raw material of our nation's history has not survived, as we know from the commemoration of today, the Custom House burning. But this strengthens the national significance of the surviving archives, such as these records that we're talking about today and the Poor Law Union archives. So the archives of Ireland's grand juries in most local authorities are the oldest surviving public records held. These are records which enable historians to discover aspects of social, economic and political life at the most local of levels in almost every corner of the county. Grand jury collections have generally been accessible for research at local archive services for many years now, and some are also available in local libraries, I should mention, and as well as in other institutions. And a growing number of collections are available to view on our websites, as other people have mentioned here today already. And we as archivists have always known the quality and the value of these archives for historical research. We've been aware that while they are held in local archives, they're of national significance. And we spent many years preserving, collecting, cataloguing and promoting these unique collections and providing access to the public. But with this partnership, it is planned that our digitised grand jury collections will be centralised in Beyond 2022's digital repository. This will make them searchable and accessible to all. This is a milestone for us, placing local archives on a national stage in a way we haven't seen before. So therefore, we're particularly proud to have the opportunity to show off some of the many different grand jury collections to you today. The 3 videos you'll see today will give you a flavour of the rich and varied grand jury material held in local authority archives across Ireland. So from Donegal, you'll see unfurled an 1801 grand jury map from a William McCrae survey, outlining townlands and landlords' names. You'll also see 19th century minutes from Donegal, which give an insight into the workings of and the mindset of the Donegal grand jury during the Great Famine. And we'll also see letters from grand jury members to the new county council members in 1899, as administration of the county was being handed over very reluctantly by the grand jury, and some of the issues that arose, including the loss of grand jury property such as linen and silverware and power, of course. And then Lisa Shorthall will showcase some of Offaly Archives' presentments for the years from 1830 to 78, outlining some of the works that were undertaken, including, as we've heard earlier on from Brian, the building of roads and bridges, and also displayed our coroner's inquest report books, which are quite unusual records to have survived. And she'll show some printed lists of eligible jurors. And photographs from the 19th and early 20th century are hard to find, and thus it's great that from Offaly there are photographs of the assize judges arriving at Tullamore Courthouse in the 1910s, and a photograph of the judge who presided over the last assize court in 1921. And then Catherine in Wicklow, Catherine Wright, will display and talk about collections, including more presentments, including a wide range of services, including accompanying prisoners to jail, deserted children, etc., and some of the payments that they have to the town crier and other occupations, which have long since vanished from public life. There are also grand jury payment books, which note how the higher officials were paid by who were in the employ of the grand jury. And then there are some beautifully designed architectural drawings related to the refurbishment of buildings in Wicklow. These are just some samples of some of the many thousands of items in the grand jury archive collections across the country, across the island from Derry to Kerry. As you'll see from the upcoming presentations, these archives have extraordinary research significance, not least in terms of local family, political, social and economic history for our country. And Beyond 2022's publication, People, Place and Power, will give you an even greater idea of the grand jury system and the significance of the records. The accompanying list of archives held in repositories is an interim listing, but that will continue to be updated as more sources are discovered. So lastly, I'd really like to extend my thanks to Beyond 2022 and especially Peter, Brian and Kieran, and it's been great so far working with you all. And we really do look forward to continuing our collaboration and partnership into the future. So thank you very much. And I now just want to hand you back to Kieran.
Thanks very much, Niamh, for those kind words and the Mutual Admiration Society here today, but I think probably well deserved. We've moved straight on to the first of the videos that Niamh was talking about. This is from our own county archives in Lifford and Donegal. So if you can roll it there, please, Francesca, and then I'll pop back in at the end.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Niamh Brennan.
We're here today in Lifford to look at some of our great collections of archives. One of the greatest collections we have is the Donegal Grand Jury. It's our oldest public collection. Under the 1898 Local Government Act, grand juries were largely replaced by county councils and local authorities, modern local authorities. So the grand jury's functions were taken over by the county council in Donegal. The grand jury had a lovely premises here in Lifford. It had the county house, and it had its own dinner service and its own linens, its own chairs, and it didn't really want to give those up. And in fact, it didn't want to give up any of its premises to the county council. So a series of letters were written between the county council members and the grand jury members, and this dispute about all these materials went on for quite a while. Here's an example of a letter from John Hamilton of Brown Hall, Ballantrae, to Knox, another member of the grand jury, and actually this photograph here, you can see Hamilton himself just here with the fob watch. So he is basically asking that a committee be formed to arrange with the county council for both bodies to use the room as required, and that this committee be authorised to reserve for the sole use of the grand jury the silver service and the linen service as well. Now we're going to look at a Donegal grand jury map. And this is one of the oldest maps we have, possibly the oldest maps we have in our collection. The map followed a survey by William McCrae of the county of Donegal, and he was commissioned by the grand jury to do that survey. So the map is really interesting for a number of reasons. Apart from its physical beauty and the fact that it's so rare, it has listed baronies, parishes, townlands, and the names of individual towns that we'd recognise now today, and smaller areas that may not be around. We have Stranorlar, Convoy there, where you can see the name of the Montgomerys, who were the landlords there. And if you look up further up to the very top of the county, just near Tory there on your right, you will see the Alforts, were the landlords in charge there, and the Stewarts at Hornhead. So there's a number of landlords mentioned on this map, which is really interesting facet of it. I mean, the map is an original as well. It's pre-ordnance survey, so that makes it even more interesting. And you have this beautiful milestone that was drawn for it. I'm just going to fold it back up again now because it is very delicate. This bound volume is a minute book of the Donegal Grand Jury, dating from 1815 to 1857. These minutes were of the meetings of the Donegal Grand Jury taken at the spring and summer assizes in those years. This minute book is highly revealing about the structure of the authority itself. Its members are all very well known and very wealthy Protestant landowners. Each meeting involved setting up committees to carry out various works, and each committee was made up of grand jury members. The grand jury's own self-indulgence is in evidence, with several references, including during the famine, to ordering wine from a supplier in Dublin for itself. These recorded actions stand in stark contrast to one in 1849, outlining the grand jury, how it was deciding to modify the diet in the county jail in Lifford, which it believed was of too liberal a character, and was encouraging people to commit petty crimes to get into the jail, rather than just applying for relief in the workhouse. You can see this here in this minute book. A year later, though, the same members appointed a committee with full powers to regulate all matters concerning the supply of dinner wines to the grand jury. There are many references to the police force in the minutes, mainly with regard to rent or closure of barracks. The grand jury minute the difficulties encountered by the RIC in tackling land disturbances in the county, including during the famine years. It's fascinating to see how rural life in Donegal is viewed in these minutes from the perspective of the landowning ruling class that make up the grand jury. A specific minute relating to the RIC, which I'm going to highlight today, is the Spring Assizes of 1850. These report on the numbers in the constabulary, and it was compiled by two members of the grand jury, a baronet from Ramelton, James Stewart, and John Vandeleur Stewart of Rockhill. The report is very detailed statistically. It stated that Donegal had only half the police force of Meath, despite it being 2/3 of Donegal's population, and with Donegal having problems with agrarian disturbances. It's reported that Donegal had only one policeman for every 1,684 inhabitants, compared to, for example, one policeman for every 485 in Louth. It lists the exact numbers of police and the percentages by area and population, and it's from the 1841 census in each county. So basically the report sets out its case for additional permanent police quite well, reporting that Donegal is the 4th largest county in area, the 10th in population and only the 26th in police numbers. The report points out what it refers to as Donegal's disadvantages in its geography, and it describes the intersections and indentations of the county by deep bays, which make it very difficult for centralisation of police in the county. Basically, the report sought more equal distribution of numbers of police across the 32 counties. The Lord Lieutenant's reply was not satisfactory, though. He stated that Donegal had had opportunities to look for extra police over the years, but it hadn't done so. Any increase in one police force would lead to confusion and interminable disputes, he said. Therefore, while a lot of work obviously went into this report, little reward came the grand jury's way. All these grand jury records, the series of correspondence, the photograph, the minute book, and the presentments, they're all available to view here in Lifford at our archives, and they're also online on our website.
Kieran, you're muted.
Sorry, I muted myself on top of you. Apologies if there was a slight sound gap there on the video. I think that's a Zoom issue rather than on the original video itself. But you'll see from what Niamh was saying there, I mean, the disputes that the grand jury were fighting over the silverware, and they're trying to affect national policing policy and so forth. So the grand jury have strong opinions about themselves as an elite. I think you get a sense of this too from the next video, which is going to off-lead to Lisa Shorthall. If you want to play that one there, please, Francesca. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Lisa Shorthall. I'm the archivist here in Offaly Archives in Tullamore. This is a brand new facility completed in 2019, and it houses the archives of the local authority. That is to say, the archives of Offaly County Council and all its predecessor bodies, which would include the Grand Jury and the Board of Guardians. It also houses collections of private origin, which would have been donated or otherwise acquired by Offaly County Library and Offaly Historical and Archaeological Society over many years. So this collaboration between the local authority and the Historical Society is long-standing and has resulted in this great facility, which houses all the archives safely here today. This theme of salvaged archives runs through the history of record keeping in Offaly, it must be said. On the 19th of July 1922, a mere couple of weeks after the PRO in Dublin was destroyed by fire, the Tullamore Courthouse, which housed the grand jury rooms and the offices of the Crown and Peace, was also totally destroyed by fire as a result of Civil War fighting. We have here a minute book which actually records the council's reaction to the burning of the courthouse, which would have been their offices as well. And it says, the secretary reported for the purpose of a record on the minutes that the county courthouse and all the contents of same were burned and totally destroyed on the 19th of July. Despite saving volumes from the burnt out courthouse, the resulting grand jury collection that we have here in Offaly Archives is actually very small, and it is a reconstituted collection in that it contains items that were salvaged, donated, or indeed purchased strategically by the Offaly Historical Society or the Offaly County Library over time. So that is what is in the collection in general. We have two sets of presentments, which were bought at auction by Offaly County Library many years ago. We have one set that belonged to James Frank Rolleston from Dunkerrin in the southern tip of Offaly, and another set from Henry Trench, who was also from the south of Offaly at Shinrone. So these books were bound volumes like this. This is the Rolleston set, and they're bound in leather. There's a set of various presentments, which were the proceedings of the assizes, all bound together for Rolleston's own library. The other set, belonging to Henry Trench, are not bound in as fancy a binding as Rolleston's, but they also came up at auction. There are gaps in the sequence which are filled by editions that are in the National Archives belonging to other grand jury members. Taking a look at Rolleston's volume, we can see that he has his own book plate, JFR, for James Frank Rolleston. And we can see also that the presentments, the assizes were held in Phillipstown. We can see James Frank Rolleston's address here, James Frank Rolleston, Frankfurt Castle, March the 10th, 1830. Now we're going to look at the Jurors Lists, which form a large part of the grand jury collection that we have here in Tullamore. These were actually salvaged from the Tullamore workhouse, which was being demolished in the 1970s. To be a juror, you had to fulfill certain criteria, one of which was to either be a freeholder, a leaseholder, to be a man between the ages of 21 or 65 or 70, depending on the act in place at the time. And you had to either all that or to be rated for a poor law collection in respect of a certain value of land. So the jurors lists contain an alphabetical list of jurors, potential jurors, and they're listed by their name, where they live, what type of land they have, and the rateable value of the land. There were certain exemptions for people who did not have to serve on the jury, and these are also listed on the jurors lists. And the exemptions were really to do with age. If people had reached the age of 65 or older, they weren't allowed to serve. If they were in certain professions, they weren't allowed to serve on a jury. So RIC, policemen, lawyers, medical doctors, other professions were all exempted from jury service. But what we have here in general in the juries lists are lists of wealth and power. They were landowners who were allowed to serve on juries. A glaring omission that we can see with our 21st century eyes is that there are no women on these lists, and that is because they were not even eligible to be exempted because they weren't considered to be available for jury service in any case. We can see here the Clerk of the Union's name, James McKenna, and he was actually Clerk of Tullamore Union for 40 years. While the local government functions of the grand jury ceased in 1899, when the county councils were formed, the Assizes Courts still ran for a number of years, and they finished in 1921. There was always great pomp and ceremony when the King's judges arrived in Tullamore to sit in the Assizes, and we have here a fantastic photograph of the judges arriving at the courthouse in Tullamore. It's a very small photograph, but you can see clearly the carriage which is holding the judges arriving in the courthouse, preceded by the mounted RIC police. The carriage would have met the judges at the train station in Tullamore, and it would have brought the judges down to Tarleton House, which is in present-day O'Connor Square, and is actually the site where the County Library is now situated. And there the judges would actually get into their robes, and they would then proceed in the carriage up to the courthouse, as this photograph demonstrates here, in great style and ceremony, preceded by the mounted police. The last assize judge to sit in Kings County was Judge W.E. Wiley, and he presided over the last Assizes Court in July 1921, and we are very lucky to have a portrait of him. Judge W.E. Wiley actually became a Free State High Court judge in 1924 and continued in that role until 1936. The final type of record that we're going to look at in the grand jury collection are coroner's diaries. They're beautiful leather-bound notebooks, and we see his name here, James Dillon, coroner, Kings County coroner. So James Dillon was from Clara in County Offaly, and he was appointed in 1836, beating his rival Benjamin Toy Midgley by 190 votes. And he was then coroner for life. We do know that his last inquest was in 1859, and we know this because shortly after he recorded this verdict, he was required to travel to Edenderry to preside over another inquest, but he himself died suddenly en route, and in fact it ended up that the coroner en route to an inquest became the subject of an inquest. So this is a very small selection of the types of records in the grand jury collection here in Offaly Archives. It is a great collection to understand the evolution of local government in Offaly, and also to see the power brokers in the county at the time. Researchers are welcome to visit by appointment, and the full collection is listed on offalyarchives.com, where you'll also find the contact details. We're really looking forward to seeing you.
Thanks very much for that, Lisa. And that idea of the welcome being there, I think we're all dying to get back into the archives again. And I know the archivists are keen to see all of their service users back in. I think Lisa referred to sort of how small their collection was in Offaly. I think it's got to do with the quality of what's in it. And I think those fascinating records, like records literally of life and death in the archives, were really interesting to see. We're going to move further east now to County Wicklow and to Catherine Wright in the archives there. Thanks, Francesca.
Hello, my name is Catherine Wright and I'm the archivist with Wicklow County Archives here in Wicklow Town. Like most local authority archives, we hold the records of the County Council, but we also hold the records of the various predecessor bodies such as the Town Commissioners and the Poor Law Union, and the records that we're going to talk about today, the Wicklow Grand Jury. The Wicklow Grand Jury met twice a year at the spring and summer assizes, where they discussed the proposed presentments for works to be carried out around the county and approved those works and payments. So the first series of records we're going to look at today are the Presentment Books, which are printed lists of those works, and they contain quite a lot of detail about the officials who worked for the Grand Jury, their salaries, where a lot of where the work took place, the location of the roads that were repaired. And what is very valuable to the local and family historian is that a lot of the people who were resident on that property are named, and particularly in terms of the townland that they lived in. So this can be a great way of locating an ancestor. For instance, here we have a description of contractor Andrew Byrne, who carried out work in Wooden Bridge and in between Mr. Sherwood's Gate in Killihurler and James Finn's Bridge. So you can see the amount of detail about the people who lived there who may not have been captured in other official records of the day. So it's highly valuable to family historians. And then when it comes to the officials working for the Grand Jury, we have Edward Story, who was the governor of Wicklow Jail, along with his wife Mary Story, the matron. We actually had the descendants of Edward and Mary Story contacted us a few years ago, and we were able to research this couple. Edward started out as a turnkey or prison officer in the jail and married the matron, Mary Morris. In 1858, they had a large family, and Edward worked his way up to becoming governor of the jail. He was actually essentially the last governor of the jail before it was downgraded to a bridewell in 1876. And the presentments here show their pension payments under superannuation. So we had public service pensions even in those times. This brings us on to another series of records that we have here in Wicklow Archives, the payment books for the Grand Jury. And we see here Edward's pension payment, which at the time was £75, quite a lot of money in those days. It was quite a high status position to hold. And other officials working for the Grand Jury, including Carter Draper, who would have been the county surveyor at that time. We have courthouse expenses, the town crier, and other people working for the Grand Jury and the payments made to them. So quite a lot of information here for the local historian. So the Grand Jury, as the years went on, was considered to become increasingly corrupt. Many landlords sought to increase the value of their own estates by getting works done, maybe that were not particularly in the public interest, but more from the estate's perspective. And often public works were not checked on completion. So the English government, to try and reform the system, introduced the office of the county surveyor. And here we have some beautiful hand-drawn plans from the county surveyor, Henry Brett, who drew these plans in 1876. These were for the refurbishment of the courthouse in Wicklow Town. This is where the Grand Jury would have met. And as you can see, there's fabulously ornate decorations on the ceiling and the cornices. Presumably the Grand Jury would have felt that this would have reflected their status. I think you will agree that the records of the Wicklow Grand Jury are hugely valuable to researchers of all interests, especially local and family historians. We see evidence of the development of the infrastructure of the county, and many of the roads, bridges and public buildings we see around us today were built and maintained under the aegis of the Wicklow Grand Jury. We also get a sense of what life was like in the county, the social conditions of the time. We see mentions of the upkeep of orphans and deserted children, the accompaniment of prisoners, and the various salaries for the officials that worked for the Grand Jury. Perhaps most importantly for family historians are the references to the various people and the home places they lived in, the kinds of works that were done on their property, and the contractors who were working for the Grand Jury at that time. If you would like to come and visit the Wicklow County Archives, our contact details are on wicklow.ie, and you will also find our digitised collections on wicklow.ie also, including the presentment records of the Grand Jury that we looked at today.
Thanks very much for that, Catherine, too. And I think you can see from there, from what Catherine was saying, the value to genealogists as well. It's not perhaps immediately evident when you open a presentment book what use this is to a family historian, but understanding the locality, understanding the social structures, I think can really add colour to any family history that you just, rather than just getting the flat dates of when great granny was born and died. I'm going to be joined now by the three archivists that we met on the video clips there, but also by their colleagues, Martin Morris from Longford County Library and Archives, Joanne Rothwell, Waterford City and County Archivist, and Gráinne Doran, the archivist with Wexford County Archive. Niamh, Lisa and Catherine will also join us, and just to have a discussion about the usefulness of the Grand Jury records, and to sort of thrash out some of the particular strengths held in particular counties. There are more counties than are present here, but some of the archives that talk about the strengths in some of the archives that we've encountered here today. So perhaps if I can turn to Gráinne first in Wexford. Gráinne, is Gráinne with us? Yes, there you are. Okay, gotcha. Thanks, Gráinne. Just to ask, you were saying that the strengths of Wexford's own Grand Jury collections in the light of some of what we've seen today on the videos. Do you want to comment on some of your Grand Jury holdings in Wexford, please?
Yes, thanks, Kieran. And just before I say anything, I'd like to echo Niamh's sentiments there as well, and extend my thanks to the Beyond 2022 team, to Brian, David, Kieran and Peter in particular, for the invaluable sources, the document now that will be a centralizing source, if you like, for highlighting the importance of this series of records in local archive services in particular. And I suppose none of our collections are finite in any way. We have all certain gaps and, considerable gaps, but I'm an archivist and many of my colleagues, like myself, live in hope of acquiring further records to supplement our collections. And I suppose in County Wexford's case, up to 2 years ago, our earliest Grand Jury holding was a printed record of a trial of an RIC constable in Newtown Barry, which is now Bunclody. And he was charged with murder of a woman, Mary Mulrooney, at a market day in which a number of cattle were seized for tithe composition rent due to a local Reverend McClintock. And that is quite, it's a printed report, and it turns out in the very end that he was acquitted of same. There was only one witness who proved to be unreliable in actually pointing to him as the person that killed her. But the mainstay of our collection in Wexford are the printed abstracts of presentments and the schedule of applications. But as I said, 2 years ago, that all changed when we acquired a lovely large manuscript book of presentments covering the period 1817 to 23. And I have to say as well, while local archive services rely almost exclusively on the goodwill of members of the public coming forward and depositing items in our collections for future research purposes. Sometimes we have to, fund such acquisitions as well. And this particular volume, handwritten volume covering the period 1817 to 23, presented itself at auction. And it was a unique item in its own right. So we were thankfully successful in acquiring it. And just inside the title page is, I suppose you would call it, a who's who of all the major landowners, property owners, landed gentry, serving MPs, who were the 23 members of the grand jury in the summer assizes in 1817. And just, I suppose, just to give a very quick flavour of the content of it, again, echoing Niamh, Lisa and Catherine as well, in terms of the content of the presentment books. But the number of women, and I know Brian touched on it earlier as well, and I was very surprised myself, and I'm glad that he referred to it, because it's very comforting to know that there were so many women, and just in so many aspects as well. Also, providing coals, provisions, groceries, rent of session houses on land that they had, and there was also one in I think it was 1818, where Mrs. Margaret Jekyll of Feathered in County Wexford was presented as a fit and proper person to be instructed in midwifery, and was to be received in the lying in hospital in Dublin for training. And I think there were 3 other incidences within that manuscript volume of women receiving training or being sent to training for Dublin, or to Dublin for midwifery. And I suppose touching on the corruption element of the grand juries, it's sort of implied in an order in 1818 that the secretary of the grand jury and his clerk be ordered to make an affidavit at the session that they have not jointly or individually received any fee or reward in ensuring presentments. And yes, very much so. And that was, and of course then also interesting, you have local government the 1889 Act and the county councils coming into effect in 1899, and I suppose as a precursor to the compulsory purchase orders as such, you have a payment in 1819 of £12, 19 shillings and 2p paid to the widow Carton for damages she sustained by the new line of road running through her lands, which is interesting as well. And somebody that isn't related to me, but there was at the summer assizes in 1819, the sum of £20 was ordered to be paid to William Donovan, a sub-sheriff, for his expenses in erecting a gallows and executing a man called Solomon Doran of Templeoudigan.
I'm sorry for your troubles.
So that is just, now obviously the printed presentments are searchable, and it's wonderful to have those online. And as Brian said as well, we only very recently digitized and made available online that handwritten book as well.
Super.
There are a number of allied collections as well, but there probably isn't time now to talk about them today as such.
But to know that they're there and are searchable online, are readable online, but this is even what you just touched on there briefly, the stories that can come out of the grand jury records, they really repay a little bit of time just to work through them, because the colour, the colour, sometimes very negative colour that comes out, I think is really super. It's fascinating what you're saying, that your collections were able to move into an earlier period, because that's something I know that Martin wanted to refer to, was that Martin Morris in Longford, that there's often a difficulty in doing local history before a certain point in the 19th century. And I think, Martin, if I can just turn to you, you had some thoughts on the grand jury records and the earlier period for local history research.
Yeah, thank you, Kieran. Yeah, I suppose if we think in terms of the sources that are available for local history in the different centuries, and I'm sure there are some local historians tuning in today, the 18th century is a particularly difficult period to research, and likewise the early 19th century. because it's only as the 19th century progresses that you have parish records and the valuation books and the ordnance survey maps, and the detail and the variety of material grows as the century progresses. But the grand jury material can, I think, to a certain extent, substitute for the lack or the loss of earlier collections, such as those that were in the Public Record Office of Ireland, those that were in the Custom House. And now, I suppose some of the points that I've been thinking about have been made by previous speakers, but if you think in terms of people and place, in addition to the landlords, who are obviously prominent because they were the grand jurors, you also have, for example, the overseers of the works. They're named. The contractors are named. And in one particular instance recently, I was helping a researcher here in Longford with some family research. And it transpires that some of her ancestors were actually road contractors. And the name and the town land of her great-grandfather and his brother are mentioned in some of our mid-19th century printed presentments. And that's wonderful because, again, if you think about filling out the family history, and as you said yourself, it's not only about identifying when great-grandfather was born, it's also seeing what he actually did in life. And the fact that he was part of that system and that he put presentments forward and that he was given X amount of money for repairing a road in the barony of Moydu or in the barony of Shrewell, that adds, I suppose, colour and detail that's really, really important.
Absolutely, and I think as you mentioned, I think in a previous conversation we'd had about the less, if the grand jury are the elite, the opposite end of the political spectrum can come up sometimes in some of the legal records. I think who's actually taking cases, who's being charged in court, and those sorts of things, or who's getting into the very beginning of the legal structure.
Yeah. And I suppose, again, just to illustrate a point from our own 18th century material here, where sometimes you can get more than one side of the story. There's a village in the south of Longford called Legan. Now, I suppose I have to confess an interest because it's my own local area. But in looking at our first grand jury book, which Brian referred to earlier on, there is reference to the building of the Bridge of Legan in 1768, that the specifications of the bridge are given and some nice detail on the structure. And at the same session, further along, there was a presentment made to the widow Farrell, from whose property the stone had come for the building of the bridge.
Okay.
And again, you get a little more detail, a little vignette there, that this woman lived close to the bridge. There was obviously a quarry on her land, and the quarry was used to extract the stone for the building of this structure, which is still in existence and probably largely the same structure with probably some modifications since the 1760s.
I know it's remarkable, isn't it? Yeah, the tangible evidence of the streets and buildings and roads around us. Absolutely. If you're talking about the very earliest period of the 18th century and going backwards, I know Joanne had some comments, Joanne, in Waterford, about the end of the grand jury system as we move into the 20th century and some sort of change and continuity. There was some apparent change, but some things didn't change so much. Joanne, I think you had something to say on that.
I was just pointing out that one of the administrative decisions that was made in relation to the 1898 Local Government Act was the requirement that they have appointees from the previous grand jury, sort of suggesting, maybe a little bit snottily, that sort of these newly elected, popularly elected county councillors wouldn't know how to run things, and that they needed some appointees from the previous grand jury system, the elite who knew how things ran and sort of could show them how it would work. And so in Waterford, 3 of the grand jury members were appointed to the new county council. There was R.J. Usher, Sir William Philip Paul, and Bonaparte Wise. These are all big landed estate names in Waterford. And in fact, the Paul name comes up again because Waterford also inherited the secretary of the grand jury. That again was a decision that was taken nationally. So in all cases where there was an existing grand jury secretary who wasn't changing, they would remain in situ for the new county council. Again, to sort of show these people how it was done and make sure that they kind of followed the proper procedures. But it's a kind of an interesting suggestion. One of the things that came up in our records here is the R.G. Paul, who was the grand jury secretary and became the first secretary of the county council. He died in 1918. And the council actually delayed a month or two before passing a vote of sympathy. And it was quite a kind of a kind of half-hearted, well, it's very perfunctory vote of sympathy. They just direct that a vote of sincere sympathy be conveyed to Mrs. Paul, the widow of the late Secretary, Mr. R.G. Paul. And if you contrast that with the vote of sympathy on the death of his successor, J.H. O'Sullivan, it says that the council place on record its appreciation of the late Mr. O'Sullivan and his many excellent qualities, and of his ability, zeal and unfailing courtesy at all times during the long period of his office. Now, whether that's a result of the change in sort of cultural attitudes between 1918 and 1945, or it's a holdover from the fact that they've inherited R.G. Paul from the previous system, and that perhaps things were a little bit formal, and that there wasn't that sort of sense of connection.
So it's a legacy appointment. Yes, I've read a lot on do a lot of work on local government, and I think those simple things like resolutions of sympathy over a death and a bereavement, I think you can read a lot between the lines on those. I completely agree with your take on that. Sorry, Catherine, did you want to jump in on that?
Well, certainly we found in Wicklow that the colour of local life really came through in these records, and over the years, looking through the different occupations and roles, I think I mentioned the town crier, and we've other references to repairs of different buildings and supplies like straw for the prisoners, those kinds of things, candles. It just gives a real sense of what life was like then. And really, even from the family historian's point of view, they place an ancestor often at a time when records were very patchy.
Yeah.
So if you had a Church of Ireland ancestor and the register didn't survive, and they happened to be a land owner or a tenant where work was carried out, all of a sudden there they are in records where you might not get them. And equally, if you're fortunate enough that your ancestor was an official, you can really build up a really colourful picture of that person, not only from the grand jury, but if you combine it with maybe newspaper reports at the time.
Absolutely, yes.
And he may have been involved with the Poor Law Union as well. So you're getting this really textured build-up and profile of an ancestor where he may have just had births, deaths and marriages, you know. So
and that interlinkedness, absolutely.
Records.
Yeah, I think so. I think, Joanne, did you want to come back in on that, Joanne?
So I was just going to say, the other thing, as was pointed out by a few of our speakers, is that it's often in very small little resolutions or very small little points within the grand jury presentment books that you get a huge picture of what life was like. In one of our presentments, there's just a point made that the courthouse keeper can actually sell beer for when the assizes are on. And then at the follow-up meeting in the next month, he's told just beer, not spirits. So we kind of get a sense that the assize day is actually a big day out, and there's there's great community spirit, shall we say, to be had at that event. So it's kind of really interesting within both in terms of the sort of even though that's a sentence or two, it gives you a real picture and flavour of what life was like in Waterford at that point in time. But also the other thing that's really significant in the records is sometimes the sequence, so that you can often build up a picture of what happened, not because you have one small reference in one presentment, but because you have the next year and the next year and the next year.
Yeah.
And so this kind of gives you a much fuller picture of what was happening. And so sometimes it can be, for a researcher, it can be an absolute goldmine, provided that you put in the sort of the time.
Yes.
But it really does reward that time and effort when you put it in.
I think they don't give themselves up easily, I don't think. Sorry, there's a couple of people want to jump in there. Martin, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, just briefly.
And then I'll come to you, Grania.
In relation to the 18th century, of course, it was the period of the penal laws, and
of course,
in our earliest or our earlier manuscript book here, there are references to 4 priests who would have conformed to the Church of Ireland and who received annuities. There were laws that were passed through the century that provided increasingly large sums of money to Catholic priests who became Church of Ireland, and payments were made through the grand jury. And certainly in 2, if not 3 of the instances, I think there were 4 altogether, the only contemporary reference other than in the conformity rolls to those priests receiving payments like those are in the grand jury books. And another, I suppose, issue that's related is the Diocesan School here in Longford Town. Payments for the maintenance and the upkeep of it and the repair of it would have been approved by the grand jury also. And that was, of course, a Church of Ireland school. But it's important because it was an institution, and a significant institution of its time in the town.
Locally, absolutely. And I think it's interesting what you just mentioned there about the clergy conforming. I think there were central lists of those kept in the Public Record Office. They, I presumably, were gathered from the grand juries and kept as a central list, and we can see the listing for those in the forecourts, and it's burnt. But yet the ingredients that created them are available in some counties. So that's an exact example of what Beyond 2022 is doing in trying to track down these copies or duplicates at the time. Sorry, Gron, you want to jump in on that?
Oh, thanks, Guren. No, I just wanted to make the point that following on from Catherine's comments there as well about family history potential, but also in the county infrastructure, in the absence of other records, you know, in the various progression developments in infrastructure such as the building or rebuilding or reconstruction of bridges, piers, roads, and also all the public buildings as well. And certainly in County Wexford, we have very few records going back that far for those. And in a way, it's a pointer as well to the secondary sources of our newspaper collection in the county, you know, which can really flesh out then. You have a couple of lines of, you know, Wexford Free Bridge and, or say, New Ross Bridge, which would sort of stagger across Kilkenny, into Kilkenny and Wexford as well. And it would be better, you know, sort of documented, if you like, in the newspaper collection of the time, where they exist, of course, as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that point of using the grand jury as there might only be a small fact in a grand jury or a small presentment repeated over a couple of years, but to link that then to other records, perhaps to land records or perhaps to newspaper records, that sort of thing, I think totally does open them up. I'm just curious to know from any of the archivists present, do genealogists tend to use them? Do you have people coming to you with genealogical inquiries who would turn to them automatically, or do people tend not to know about them and you're bringing them to the public attention, do you find? To any of you? Niamh has a hand up there. Oh, you're on mute, Niamh. You're on mute. Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah, sorry. I think that my own experience in Donegal is that the grand jury records tend to be utilised quite a lot by academics, and they can be, and I've noticed that people have come from far and wide, you know, from America, from Canada, from the UK and from various parts of Ireland to look at them for academic purposes, but not so much for genealogy, except in more recent years. I think that kind of now we're beginning to, obviously with this project, but even before that, once you start to put them up online, people begin to realise that they, you know, that they have genealogical interest. But I think the main thing that has been a problem with people was that they're hard to search because they're by barony or whatever, and they're, you know, it's literally as you're kind of saying to them, well, okay, you think your ancestor might have been a contractor, but you're not sure. Well, unfortunately, you know, say 3 or 4 years ago, they'd have to go through, even if they knew the barony, they'd have to go through document after document, volume after volume to try and find that person. And obviously there's gaps as well then in the collection, even in the 19th century ones. Yeah, indeed. But yeah, I think but what the others have said there just proves that how good they actually are, and that they can be a kind of a substitute for the collections that we don't have, you know.
Yep, I think this is it. I think we're all finding that. Sorry, Catherine, you want to jump in there? Thanks.
As Niamh was saying there, they were in the past very difficult to search, but really because we're able to digitize them and because they're typescript, you can simply search keywords, names, place names, or a topic if you're interested in researching a certain aspect. And I suppose, trying to promote them as research tools, even for school children to use for different local history projects, things like that, very much about their own locality. But yes, traditionally, as Niamh was saying, they were tough to search, but technology has made all of this so much easier now.
I agree. And just before I pick up the other two, just pick up the thread of what you're saying there, Catherine, we found in preparing for this, I thought I knew a little bit about the grand jury records, but actually when you start digging into them and you're seeing these payments for killing otters, and otters are considered as vermin, and then payments for children being boarded out, and it just gives you this sort of way of doing local history or social history in all sorts of ways I wouldn't have anticipated. I'll go to Joanne and then to Niamh, if that's okay. Sorry, Joanne first. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Guren. I was just going to point out in relation to the to the grand jury records that you were mentioning, if a number of the speakers mentioned place, and some of the descriptors, they point out person's name and the location. And as you said, often that person isn't there anymore. So it's like giving directions saying, go past the blue shed, but the blue shed doesn't exist.
We all know where it was.
But actually, what I have found in terms of local researchers in particular is that they have been really good. They have actually, because of local knowledge combined with the record and combined with the grand jury map and the ordnance survey map, people are have been able to actually pinpoint very precisely the location. Combining that sort of local oral history, maybe the valuation records that identify who was living there at that point in time, or the tithe allotments, and the grand jury records combined then with the other maps. So one of the things that one of the great benefits of the local archive is that we have a number of different interconnecting records, and we also have local historians and local researchers that when they all combine, they can actually be really astonishing in what they can do.
They're more than the sum of their parts.
So impressive.
Absolutely. Niamh and then Martin, please. And then I got some questions in the audience that I'll come back to. So Niamh first and then Martin.
Yeah, it was just one thing I wanted to mention that was more about the kind of the cross-county issue, if you like, which I found when I was looking through the minutes from 1815 to 1857, obviously that Omagh and Strabane and Tyrone and Derry were mentioned an awful lot in terms of roads that were being built from one part of the county of Donegal up to Derry. Or there was also this element that came up about the asylum. There was a so-called lunatic asylum that was in Lifford, but it was obviously quite full in the 1840s, and they wanted to extend it. So they were hoping to build a kind of a super asylum, if you like, and they were thinking about building that in Omagh, and they had to get people from Derry as well as from Omagh as well as from Donegal to have this discussion with the bishop of Derry. But nothing came of it in the end. I think they decided to go ahead and build it in Omagh, and that would mean that there'd be more space then for patients in Lifford. But it is just interesting to see that, because it seemed to be such a fluid and natural kind of connection there. Yeah, and now you realise how things have changed in terms of the geography, the political geographical elements. So just wanted to.
The natural hinterlands, I think, around market towns and so forth. Absolutely, even geographically within valleys and watercourses and things. I think
exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, fascinating. Interesting point. Sorry, Martin in Longford. Martin Morris.
Yeah, just Kieran, in regard to the work that we're doing with yourselves and Beyond 2022. The fact that some of our collections have been submitted to the Project for Inclusion on the website, that opens up the possibility of comparative studies and the interrogation of the material in a way that wouldn't be possible, or would be possible but would be difficult, because it would involve people going from maybe website to website, but also from location to location to actually visit and see the material in its original state. And you can look at various possibilities for regional studies where you put neighbouring counties together. I know one example that was mentioned in a previous discussion we had was where you have a landowner who has property in a number of counties, which was very often the case. And you can see their influence on the grand jury in the counties in which they own property.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really important. It's the county, in a sense, is I mean, we live with this, but in fact, it's quite a false border in some ways. It's not necessarily how people live their actual lives, and it's not how property was owned, for sure. Sorry, Niamh, did you want to come back in? You have your hand up there, or was it okay? I just see a question from the audience here. I just want to feed this out, if that's okay. Sorry, this is from Sean Bryn, and Sean is commenting on the records that he has used, and he's saying his concern is that these records are sometimes on microfiche and not digitized, or even on microfilm, and hopefully these records will be digitized as part of the 2022 project. Just to mention on that, in Beyond 2022 we have access to Transcribus, which is a machine learning technology for reading handwriting, and now there are technological limitations to all these things, but one of the things it's had some success with is actually converting or transcribing microfilm records, and we've done that with some records from some of the people here. They've shown us the microfilm records, and we've taken images from them and been able to transcribe those. So there is some chance that records that were on microfilm can actually be converted onto sort of on-screen, online kind of format. But that's work that's actually proceeding at the moment with some success. One thing I just wanted to ask then of the group in general, looking at some of the super maps. So the L. Brown collection have very kindly donated this set of grand jury maps, and they are spectacular, and I'd urge the audience to go and have a look at them. But reading the maps in conjunction with the grand jury records, that's something that I know Brian referred to and talked about in his talk, and I've seen him go on Twitter about it as well, Brian Guren. It's something I'd never actually done before. Is anybody in the group of archivists here, that notion of positioning the maps alongside the text, is that something that you've done or that researchers in your institutions have done? Joanne?
Yes, we've actually done it in a number of cases, not so much for a kind of historical research purposes, but to answer current questions in relation to public roads. So it acts as a really good resource for the local authority in terms of whether or not it's public roads. So our GIS system has done comparisons between the 1818 grand jury map, the 1963 County Road Act, and the 1842 Ordnance Survey map. So between sort of those three records, we've often used them and compared and contrast, and then used our manuscript road contract books to answer some queries we have in relation to whether there's public rights of way or whether roads are public roads originally. And so they're actually not just a historical resource, they're also continue to function as a valuable record for the local authority in terms of the infrastructure that's there. And as Martin said, like a lot of the bridges and other infrastructure are still our bridges and our infrastructure. So any of the information that we have from our contract books, we have utilized that as well when when our engineers are taking a look at some of the bridges to see the dates that it might originally have been built. Sometimes there might be information in terms of the materials that were used. And these are all valuable resources for the day-to-day work that the local authorities continue to carry out. So I suppose that's the wonderful thing about our records, is that they're not, while they're extremely valuable as historical resources, they're actually also practical records.
Yes, engineers can use their
infrastructure that we use day to day.
It's funny, it makes you think, that famous saying, they say, the past is another country, they do things different there. Well, actually, maybe the past is the same county is the important thing here with this. I want to thank you all very much for that. And then just to and thank you for all your time, your input here on this today. Just to turn to the audience and say that the records that we have been gathering, with the collaboration of our colleagues in the Local Government Archives and Records Managers Group, they're being listed. Brian Guren has made an extensive list, and it's a growing list. So this is a preliminary listing of all grand jury records held in local archives and state archives and other independent archives and libraries just on the island of Ireland. We think there are others overseas which we haven't encountered yet, but that preliminary listing is on our website, and you'll see the link that was in the earlier links for our web pages. So we'd urge you to look at that listing. Just to remember that if we're gathering here today on the 100th anniversary of the destruction of the Custom House and all those records that were lost, the Beyond 2022 project is based on another huge loss, destruction of the Public Record Office of Ireland in 1922. So there's a lot of talk about Irish experience of destroyed records through fire and cataclysm in that way. But of course, Ireland is not alone, and the 20th century is not the only time in history when such attacks on archives have happened. So if you want to stay with that sort of theme, or see Ireland's position in a global context and the longer history of destroyed archives and the recovery from that, I'd urge you to look up Burning the Books, which is a talk being held this evening. It's the final talk in the Out of the Ashes series on the Trinity Long Room Hub. So the Trinity Long Room Hub, the link has just gone into your the link has gone into the chat box there. So this is Richard Ovenden, who's the Bodley librarian in the University of Oxford. He's speaking this evening at 7 p.m. and he's talking about his book called Burning the Books and the the terrible, sad title is Burning the Books, A History of the Deliberate Destruction of Knowledge. And there'll be a response from Helen Shenton, who's the librarian of Trinity College Dublin and the archivist for the university. And I think that'll be a fascinating way of setting Ireland's revolutionary era story in a broader international context and in the long history context of that idea of attacks on archives. If you want to learn more about the Custom House event, particularly in 1921, History Ireland has just launched a new podcast with Liz Gillis and John Dorney and other historians taking part. So you can Google that on the History Ireland website. Our free guide to the grand jury records is on the Beyond 2022 website. So I'd urge you to go to that. It's either on the Flickbook or you can download it, and please do pass it on to all your friends, one for everyone in the audience. And those excellent grand jury maps from the L. Brown collection are there. You can zoom in as tightly as you like on those for many counties that are included in that list. Before I thank our participants today, I do want to thank in particular Francesca O'Flaherty and Aoife King, our colleagues in the Trinity Long Room Hub, which is the Arts and Humanities Research Centre. At this stage, I think Francesca and Aoife could run the Eurovision between them and still make it seem like a calm event that they do every day. So we're delighted to have had their technical help. So we really do appreciate that, folks. And to all our speakers, both earlier in today and then this afternoon with Joanne, Catherine, Niamh, Martin, Lisa, and I have a feeling I'm missing someone there on my screen, I beg your pardon. Grania, sorry, Grania. So follow us on Twitter. That's @virtualtreasury. And remember to make an appointment to visit your local archive. Make an appointment first. We're still only coming out of lockdown, but they'd be delighted to see you and to see who knows what you'll discover when you get into the local archive. So thank you all very much for your company and have a good evening. Hopefully see you later on this evening at the Ovenden Talk. Thanks now.
Thank
you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.